Matt, thank you for meeting me today. I really appreciate this. We just had lunch. It was a good lunch. Had a good talk about scripture, about faith, about our history growing up. And I just want to thank you for, all the service you do and laboring for the gospel, right? Which is essentially you're head pastor of a church. Tell us a little bit about your church.
Yeah, absolutely. New Life Assembly of God. And we've been in existence for about 90 years. I've been pastor here about 4 years, and God's doing some really cool things. So
awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So as I talked to you about, we're doing this new show called Uncommon Ground, and we're talking to people, not just believers, but also unbelievers. We're getting their perspective on all the different passages in the Bible that talk about creation. Now, some people have wildly different views on this topic,
sure.
From Scripture. So in Genesis 1, it talks about the earth being created in 6 days. Do you think those are 6 literal days?
I don't think those are 6 literal days. I think that it's a complex supernatural situation that's taking place there, and I think it's kind of beyond really a human limited explanation. Oftentimes gets oversimplified to fit into a Sunday school lesson, but I don't necessarily think that it was 6 literal days. Do I think that God's capable of creating the earth in 6 literal days? Absolutely. But I don't know that's necessarily what's being described there. So,
okay. So then you ascribe to more of the commonly taught model of there was an evolutionary process. Is it more like a theistic evolutionary idea, where just things progressed over time, but God orchestrated it?
Yeah, I don't really have a set thing that I believe this is what I can explain or describe. Just that what we see explained there, and what we have commonly given, very simple, this is what happened answers, is a really oversimplified human view of a supernatural thing that occurred. And so, can God put evolutionary processes into play? And certainly, absolutely. Can God create something out of nothing? Absolutely, certainly can. How was the creation done exactly? I think that's a lot of that to be determined. Okay. God knows, and we have a limited understanding of what that is. So
okay, so in Genesis 1, mm-hmm. in verses 2 through 8, where it talks about the spirit that hovered over the waters of the deep, mm-hmm. and then it talks about in verse 6 through 8 this thing called the rakia in the Hebrew, this firmament, mm-hmm. as it's commonly translated into the English. That was created on day 2, and it separated the waters mm-hmm. that we see in verse 2. And then, so is that firmament thing, is that literal or figurative?
Yeah, you've done a lot more study on the firmament than I have, for sure. I don't have an answer to whether that was a literal or a figurative firmament. So
okay, all right. So in Genesis 7. In verse 10 and 11, mm-hmm. when the flood begins and the waters come, mm-hmm. it says the floodgates of the heaven were opened, mm-hmm. and the waters came from above, and also the springs of the deep, mm-hmm. came from the waters flooded from below. What do you think that's speaking of? What do you think that's describing?
Yeah, I've read that and often scratched my head and asked that question. What is this describing? How does this fit into what we have? And it's really not something that's ever gets addressed a whole lot or taught about a whole lot. So I don't have a concrete answer that I would say I would be willing to say this is what happened. But it's certainly something that as you read that passage, it definitely doesn't line up with the neat little Sunday school lesson that we were often taught. So
yeah, okay, thank you. So in Matthew 24, Jesus talks about mm-hmm. the coming of the Lord. He mm-hmm. talks about him coming back, right? Or he is the Lord, right? So in verses 29 through 31 of Matthew 24, he talks about the stars of the earth, of the sky, the stars falling to the earth. Mm-hmm. This is actually repeated, yeah. And Yeshua or Jesus is repeating what Isaiah 34:4 already mm-hmm. says, but then this is later repeated again in Revelation 6:11 through 14 that mm-hmm. the stars will fall to the ground. What do you think that's describing? Is that something literal? Are stars literally going to fall to the ground at his second coming?
Yeah. As we talked about in our conversation earlier, I think a lot of times equal to the creation, the eschatological things that we see and we read is trying to wrap a human mind around, something that happens that's supernaturally, that's beyond the realm of what we know and have seen. The traditional view of that being rolled back, a lot of people just think, just Jesus is going to kind of come from behind a cloud. But I think there's something more that's taking place there. Whether that, those stars is falling to the ground is figurative or literal, I don't know.
Okay. Now, I know that modern day astronomy teaches that we currently live on an Earth with a circumference of 25,000 miles approximately. It's like 24.9 something. And that the sun is much larger than we are, and the moon is a quarter of our size, and that they're all at vast distances from us. And it also says that, that we are circling around the sun, but there's multiple verses in the scriptures that talk about the earth being stationary, never to be moved, and that the sun, specifically in Psalm 19, verses 4 through 7, the sun has its own circuits that it follows, and it circles above us, overhead, inside the firmament. What do you think about when you hear that? What comes to mind?
Yeah. It doesn't match a lot of what we have and a lot of what we know and have been told. I think that the Bible can line up with science, and that they're not as at odds as what people may have traditionally wanted that to be. But I think what you have to realize as well is that from the scientific standpoint, there's a lot of agendas behind what is taught and the theories that are explored and all those kinds of things. And oftentimes, if we're honest, from theological standpoints, there are too. There's agendas that are involved. And so, you have to ask yourself, what is the real science that there is? And then what does the Bible really say? And so I think...
Yeah, doesn't Paul say something about, even in his epistle, he talks about science falsely so called?
Yeah, I mean, it's...
Even back in his day, he was dealing with that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's a lot of what we deal with is certainly, do you hold to that what the Bible has is accurate and is true? And does it have to be at odds with science? What really do we know, and what are the agendas behind the science that we ascribe to, and all those kinds of things? And so,
And in Revelation 12, it says, talks about the dragon, the one, the serpent of old, the one called Satan, and that it says he deceives the whole world. Do you think science could be, or at least what modern day science purports, could be an avenue, a tool for that deception over the whole world?
Sure, I think that can be. I think anything can be.
Okay.
Anything in the wrong hands can be a tool that the enemy uses, can be a tool for deception. And look, we're just a fallen world, and so whatever we use, can be anything. It doesn't have to just be that, but the history that we tell. The history can be used, all kinds of things. We see it in our world today, and it's a counterfeit of the truth, and it's a counterfeit of what reality is. And so it's good to ask the questions and to explore, and not just to say that, that all science is wrong, but it's just the way that you approach that science and those kinds of things. So
okay, well, thank you so much, Matt, for the interview. This is a joy. I hope to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely.